Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I hope you don't mind if I record it as well.
Yeah, sure,
I'm
go
going to
ahead.
use a transcription app that's really good called Otter.
Mm-hmm.
So it saves me a lot of time transcribing.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, so I found your article um, as I researched the issue of the railways here. Um, and it seems quite obvious that the primary goal of the Russians is to try to disrupt um, Western weapons supplies getting to crucial areas of the country. But there do seem to be other objectives as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk about all of that to begin with.
Well, when Russians have the intention to disrupt the transportation channel, specifically the railways, you're right that it's primarily in due part to prevent Western aid, but it's also to prevent civilians to evacuate. Um, when the Ukrainians are using the rails, it's not just for them to import Western aid, it's also for them to make sure that they maximize the safety of everybody. And rails have been traditionally a very important way of transportation infrastructure, right? Particularly in Europe, it's been one of the most reliable means. So in that sense, that's also part of the problem when people are assessing. Yeah.
But then the other problem, of course, is that the Black Sea ports are blocked, and rail may be the way to get exports out, the only way to get exports out beyond the roads. But there's a serious fuel problem here now, shortages of diesel, shortages of gasoline. So the railways might be one way of looking at at getting exports out. And then finally, I don't know if this is the case, but I would think that it's also a way of getting humanitarian assistance and food into Ukraine. So in other words, it's not just got a military goal. It seems to have a fairly serious economic goal too, an economic part of their economic war against Ukraine.
Sure. I can actually share the screens for a second. I do have something ready. Wait. What are you seeing on the show? Are you seeing my whole
Right
desktop?
now, I'm just seeing a black square. Now I've got the ISW map.
Do you see, is it just the ISW map or is it the real map as well?
No, I just see the ISW map.
Okay, sure. This might be some technical issue with projecting. So the ISW continuously kind of shows the progress that the Russians are making throughout, right? So if you see here, they're primarily gaining control over the eastern side. And when you're talking about diesel and fuel and whatever else, I mean, needless to say, the Russians are a huge kind of they have a huge monopoly over all sorts of fossil fuels as such. In terms of what does this mean in other ways? Does this map show now, the real map?
No, I'm still seeing the ISW map.
Okay, let me see. Let me try to share again with the other map. Is this map visible now?
Oh, that's good.
Okay, yeah. So these are the main railroads through Eastern Europe, right? So in this sense, we see that the lower Western equivalent would be here, right? I mean, they've been going back and forth with Kiev since you've been following, since the early days of the conflict. They've obviously tried to seize Kiev. They failed to seize Kiev. So now they are kind of looking to the bottom, left-hand corner closer to Romania. That's why there's a lot of other literature being published asking about whether or not Moldova is going to be the next target after the Ukrainian tension is over. I mean, if the Russians still have any literal and metaphorical gas to keep going, perhaps, but that's not necessarily something that I would be particularly worried about. They are closer to NATO protection anyhow. So if you look here, I mean, I don't know, because when I spoke, for example, with a faculty member, I'm sorry, I forgot his name because I'm not really familiar with his work, but I can say that he's an economist and he specializes on Russian economies and on occasion, broadly speaking, Eastern European economies. And I asked him, hey, do you think that, I asked him whether or not he believes that the reason why the Russians invaded Ukraine was whether or not they have a further desire to seize the oil resources in Ukraine as well. And he said, no, that would make no sense because a lot of the primary oil resources of Ukraine are here in Donetsk and Kharkov. So they would basically be around the same area where the Russians are currently pushing. However, at the same time, I've seen some minerals map and maps of resources that would actually show that there are substantial oil resources here also in the far west. Now, the Russians haven't really shown, as you recall by the ISW map, the Russians have not really pushed for anything substantial in this area, also because it's very close to the NATO states and they would likely not dare to be too sketchy. Although Lviv itself did suffer the attack of a couple of rockets when President Biden invaded in Belgium. When President Biden stopped by the NATO summit, the Russians did drop a couple of rockets in Lviv, but there has been no grand strategy to seize this area. So in terms of resupplication, I mean, this affects all sides, right? This affects the Ukrainians that are fighting. This affects all other NATO troops that are currently assisting the Ukrainians and whatever else. And at the same time, in terms of Russians being able to resupply and whatever else, well, what we've learned from the Georgian conflict is that every 24, maximum 48 hours, the Russians do kind of need to resupplicate their ammunition and their gasoline, as far as tanks are concerned, at least. I don't see any particular reason why this wouldn't be the same issue here. I'm not sure if this fully answers your question or not, but these are kind of some of the things that we are looking at.
Do you know, I mean, there have been some hints from Ukrainian officials that they're looking at sort of alternative routes, railway routes to move stuff on after attacks on different railway targets. Are you familiar with that issue? How they're trying to use different routes?
If I understood the argument correctly, I thought the routes were just meant to be local routes, not necessarily rails, right? Because it's not like they can build railroads out of nowhere. And even recently, we have seen in the last couple of days that the Russians have been strategically bombing different kinds of places here in the far east of Ukraine where some of these transportation points would be critical. As far as humanitarian aid, I cannot comment on it further from how it gets in the country, but a lot of humanitarian things do go through Lviv, right? And in that sense, I mean, my understanding was, I might be wrong, but my understanding was that they are looking for alternative ways through the forests that are not really well known and whatever else. They would have to be kind of a local of Ukraine to really know about them. That would not necessarily show on the map. Places where drones and other kind of tracking technology is not particularly successful at identifying and tracking the specific places. So
but so the main routes are no secret to the Russians, right? I mean, they've shipped their exports to Ukraine along those routes for decades, and I guess that the gauge in much of Ukraine is also the Russian gauge rather than the European gauge. But what you're saying makes sense, that perhaps they're looking at a combination of rail and taking it off trains, putting it on trucks, taking it through very small, unknown, barely known routes, and then loading them up onto trains again. Sort of a combination of the two.
Right. I mean, it really depends how we kind of understand the Russian geographical understanding of Ukraine in this sense, right? Because I mean, the FSB also told Putin, for however plentiful many reasons, that the conflict would be over in a couple of days and Kiev would seize and whatever else, right? So intelligence miscommunications in the FSB are extraordinarily common, either because they don't trust Putin or they just want to tell him what he wants to hear, or pick your favorite kind of reason as to why you think that happens. Your guess is as good as mine, right? But in terms of how, for example, maybe you can imagine a scenario where you can say that the folks that have been in charge of transportation and trade prior to the conflict, let's say the Russians that have been rolling the trains for trade reasons, they might know sufficiently well or all the routes are and all the stops are in particular choke points where trains have to kind of travel. Like here, if we see these kind of 3 intersections here, this would be one of them. Now, yes, but to the same extent is, first of all, those couple of people, I mean, the real business is kind of keeping the same people in it, right? In terms of, it's the kind of job that you familiarize yourself fully after many, many years, right?
Mhm.
It requires a kind of sense of experience of actually being fully immersed in that position, right? So in terms of those few people that might actually know that, as far as them being Russian civilians that were riding trains, I don't see how they can be fully informative to the Russian intelligence and whatever else. In the same way that, for example, NATO had discussions about whether or not they should send such and such equipment to Ukraine because it requires an extensive amount of training. Ukraine is not in NATO. They haven't received the training to use that equipment. So chances are that it might take them too long for them to actually learn how to use such and such anti-rocket missile, for example, and whatever else. So I'm having the same kind of informative pedagogical hesitations, even with the Russian civilians being able to fully sort of explain to thousands of people at the same time where all of these choke points are and what are the successful conditions of ensuring an operation and whatever else. So it might be possible, but
Do you know where? Do you know where in your research did you determine where the main routes for Western weapons coming in are? Are they coming from Poland? Are they coming from Romania, or both? Do we know?
I mean, I'm not sure how much we can know about that, but in terms of weapons transfers, look, let's put it this way: the Russians haven't made any substantial movement on the Black Sea, right? We have not seen any significant activity of them trying to, for example, if we see the Sevastopol kind of region, right? They haven't kind of tried to seize it through the waters in that sense. I mean, President Biden has just released, if I'm not mistaken, another kind of financial package to the Ukrainians. So in that sense, when we talk about aid, we don't necessarily just talk about weapons, for example, right? We talk about a lot of humanitarian aid, and obviously the humanitarian aid is likely passing through the Western side. I would presume the Western side, for most intents and purposes, is more viable simply because it is not as geographically contested by the Russians. But I can't tell you it goes through exactly this city and at this time and whatever else.
Right. No, I get you. Couple more questions. One, why do you think the Russians want to prevent the movement of refugees out of Ukraine?
Well, at least as far as my understanding of Russian military history is concerned, Russians tend to fight very brutally and not really have a particular care for casualties and whatever else, right? I mean, we have these discussions of fair practice in war, ethical practice in war, like no chemical weapons, for example, or whatever else. Russians are not necessarily the greatest rule followers as far as international norms of violence are concerned, right? So if they can do a lot of damage as far as their kind of irrational mindset towards war is concerned, they would do it, right? I mean, we've seen them bomb hospitals, we've seen them bomb civilian spaces like schools and whatever else. I mean, we already don't have a justification at that point, let alone even further beyond that. You can ask me, you can ask the briefers of Pentagon or whomever else you'd like. We would be equally confused to give you the same answer, which is we will never be able to know what's in their mind when they are risking completely innocent lives at stake, right? This is a totally unprovoked attack. We can never actually have a fully explicit answer to this.
Yeah. My reading of international laws of war say that if civilian facilities are used for military purposes, they become legitimate military targets. Did you look at that question as to whether or not hitting civilian railroads is legitimate? Are civilian railroads legitimate if they're being used for military purposes?
I mean, the only thing that I can comment on that is an auxiliary note. For example, both the Ukrainians and the Russians are Eastern Orthodox, right? And they celebrated Easter on the same calendar under the same premises. I have read some papers that were saying that some churches, some monasteries were declared kind of safe spaces, if you want to call them that, where
Mhm.
people would at least have the chance to celebrate their Easter. Whether or not that pact was betrayed, I have not read anything about that. So I can at least safely presume that the Ukrainians had some capacity to at least participate in their Easter rituals without any sort of harm. Um, as far as, well, what does this mean for your question in the context of railroads? Well, there's always the risk of dual use, right? I mean, when we talk about, once we are in the context, either semantic or political or strategic, of infrastructure, we cannot strictly think only in one-way streets, right? We have the same problem with the Iranians, right? They're saying that they're enriching their green energy when they're clearly nuclearly proliferating, right? And so on and so forth. Everybody is entitled to be suspicious of dual use technology, especially in the context of infrastructure, right? When you transport something, you can claim you transport goods. At the same time, you can actually subtly not transport goods, right? So in terms of the Russians calling this out, well, surprisingly, they've been having a very odd strategy where I'm not sure if you recall this, but there were some lurking debates in early April where they were trying to false flag that the Ukrainians are planning on using chemical weapons.
Oh,
Right?
of course, I wrote extensively on that.
Okay, yeah. So you remember there was this back and forth and right, and then the American response was practically like, hey, usually the Russian strategy is to call out their enemy on something that they're about to do, so then we have all these awkward false flag operations, right? I haven't seen myself at least any evidence of chemical weapons being used by either side. I mean, definitely the Ukrainians don't have any chemical weapons, but I haven't read anything about the Russians either kind of maintaining that. So it's up to you to decide how people are trying to spin off these stories, right? You're the journalist, you know more about how people spin information than myself.
Right.
But the
finally,
exposure of the dual use is there. Yeah.
Right. And finally, if you could just summarize in terms of this story, why you think, what the purpose of hitting, what is the Russians' purpose in your view of hitting the Ukrainian railroad system?
For the main reason that they would want to intercept any sort of movement, right?
Yeah.
If the core capacity of movement within a state is through its rails, and as far as Eastern Europe is concerned, given that we don't have super fancy highways with 3 lanes on each side like in the West or whatever else, one of the most substantial forms of transportation is through the rails. So if you dislocate that, you can meaningfully affect all communication channels and whatever else. You can affect all sorts of ins and outs, be it resources, personnel, people, right? I mean, when you use rails, you don't only use it for the sake of sort of transporting in and out civilians, it's also for communicative purposes as well, right?
Right. And also
interceptive.
I would think that in terms of bulk, in terms of volume, the rails can shift much greater volumes of, say, ammunition and other important military resources than you can by truck, or especially by plane. And especially, it would seem to me, when it comes to roads, the rails become more important given the fuel problems they're having here now.
This is also an archaic strategy because this is a potential double loss as well. I think that we really have to analyze this through the prism of mutual consequences, because these are nonetheless neighboring countries, right? When you play football in the rain, it affects both sides equally. So when the Russians actively choose to damage the rails to interfere with any sort of Ukrainian tactics, they're also shooting themselves in the foot, because that also decreases their capacity to move stuff in and out. So they have to weigh these things themselves, right? I mean, if you think about it, the rails weren't the primary tactical target at first, right? They went after Kiev, it didn't work out. They tried to harass Lviv, that didn't work either. Eventually, they gained traction in the east, kind of in and out, a little back and forth for a couple of weeks. But the rails themselves weren't the primary target, because the Russians had to bring in their people, they had to bring in their weapons and whatever else. And now that they have brought a substantially meaningful amount of weapons where they can think they can win the war, then they're like, okay, fine, we can take the double loss, we can cut it on both sides. They don't need the rails any further to bring more resources in, and at the same time they feel the increased confidence to perhaps also deny the Ukrainians something meaningful. So yeah.
But down the road, they're going to need to export things themselves, and they're, as you point out, it's a two-edged sword. They're destroying one of the resources that on which they depend to do their own exports into Western Europe.
I don't think Russians are necessarily thinking too much about international trade at the moment. I mean, given the scope of sanctions, right?
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, not even the Chinese are fiscally assisting the Russians or militarily assisting them. So I think they are so tunnel visioned on whatever agenda they had with Ukraine that they're totally neglecting the long-term consequences of what's going to happen in a couple of months once they stop having this kind of traction, right? The West is always going to outcash Russia. That goes without a shadow of a doubt, as far as I'm concerned, right? I mean, whether or not these sanctions are going to be as meaningful as economic foreign policy makers are going to say, obviously we all hope so. Whether or not can we know? Well, this is the first time we've ever seen this buzz phrase of economic warfare being used so rigidly and strictly, right? So what are the long-term consequences of such economic warfare? We cannot know because we don't have sufficient historical evidence to really examine the long-term impacts of this. We'll see.
Okay, this was great, Andrew. I greatly appreciate your help.
Yep, sure. Anything else I can do for you?
Nope, it's good. Are you teaching now at GW?
No, I'm actually just helping them proctor exams. I work for WWF now. I'm on their yeah. I'm on their business coordination teams. So yeah, I'm more thinking about saving koalas and pandas and bison.
That's fine. All right, listen, thank you so very much. Thanks
yeah,
for
sure, no
staying up
problem. Take good care. Hope the paper ends up well.
All right.
Have a good one.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.